Good evening. You must be our visitor. I was hoping you wouldn't let the rain put you off. Do come in, but mind the top step. It has a habit of becoming rather slippery after an evening shower, and I should hate for our first memory together to involve you arriving more quickly than you intended. There now. Before we go any farther, listen. Can you hear it? No, not the rain. The quiet behind it. Those were the last footsteps leaving the department for the day. They've only just faded beyond the front doors. A few moments ago, this entrance hall was full of the pleasant business of ordinary work. Archivists returning journals, surveyors delivering reports still smelling faintly of sea air and damp woodland, visitors asking questions, porters carrying boxes that always seemed just a little heavier than they expected. Now, though, the building is beginning to breathe a little more slowly. I've always liked this part of the evening. It feels rather like the moment a house settles after its guests have gone home. Not lonely, simply comfortably itself. If you walk with me, we'll begin here. The great entrance doors have just been locked for the night. Magnificent things, aren't they? They're considerably older than the building around them. No one seems entirely certain where they came from. I've heard at least 6 perfectly convincing explanations over the years. Personally, I rather hope none of them are correct. Libraries ought to keep 1 or 2 mysteries entirely to themselves. Now, listen carefully. There. That sound. Not the sharp click of a modern lock. A slow, reassuring clunk, followed by that little sigh the old oak always gives once it's satisfied everything is properly secured. I don't imagine anyone else would notice. After enough evenings here, however, one begins to recognize the sounds that tell you the library is ready for the night. There, the department is closed. At least, closed to the outside world. For us, the evening is only just beginning. Forgive my manners. I haven't even introduced myself yet. I am the Senior Librarian. It's a pleasure to meet you. If this is your first visit, then allow me to offer you the warmest of welcomes. If, however, you have the curious feeling you've been here before, perhaps in a dream, or in one of those memories that never quite settles into a particular day, then I shall simply say, welcome back. The library has always had an odd way of remembering people, even when they aren't entirely certain they remember it. Now then, there is no itinerary this evening, no schedule, no examination at the end. I've always thought libraries become rather shy if one tries to hurry through them. They are much happier when allowed to introduce themselves in their own time. So, we'll wander. We'll stop whenever something catches our attention. And if we become distracted along the way, well, I suspect that's exactly what the library was hoping would happen. Excellent. We've arrived at precisely the right moment. The lamps. I do so enjoy this part of the evening. Many of them are still lit by hand. Not because electricity has somehow failed to reach us. The department embraced modern conveniences many years ago, wherever they proved genuinely useful. Some of the newer reading lamps are electric now, but the great lanterns and the oldest lights continue to be tended each evening. This is simply one tradition no one has ever felt inclined to abandon. Would you believe I can still remember my first evening lighting them? I was convinced I'd forget which one came next. The librarian before me merely smiled and said, "Don't worry, the lamps know the order better than we do." I've never entirely decided whether he was joking. One by one they awaken, not all at once. Libraries dislike sudden brightness. Instead, little islands of warm amber light appear throughout the rooms. A desk here, a reading chair there, a favourite corner waiting patiently for tomorrow's visitor. I've always believed libraries should remain just a little softer than the outside world. Too much light encourages haste. A gentler glow seems to persuade people that there is no particular reason to rush. And between ourselves, I think the books prefer it that way too. Now then, as we continue along the gallery, you'll notice we're acquiring company. Don't be alarmed. They're only portraits, though I sometimes suspect they listen rather better than most people. The names are recorded elsewhere. This evening we'll allow them a little privacy. Some were librarians, others archivists. Several were surveyors who spent so much of their lives outdoors that persuading them to sit still long enough for a portrait became something of an expedition in itself. I make a habit of nodding to them whenever I pass. Old habit. No rule requires it. It simply seems polite. After all, most of what you'll see this evening exists because someone, like them, quietly cared enough to preserve it. I hope they approve of what we've made of the place. I rather think they do. Here we are. This has always been one of my favourite rooms. Not the grandest, not even the largest, just comfortably itself. During the day, it's rarely empty. Researchers sit beneath the green lamps making notes they'll almost certainly revise tomorrow. Maps spread themselves across the great oak tables as though trying to remember where they were last unfolded. Letters are compared, dates checked, tiny annotations admired beneath magnifying glasses. Every now and then, someone discovers the answer to a question they've carried for years. Usually inside the very book they almost decided wasn't worth opening. Libraries have a delightful sense of humour. This evening, though, everything has gone home. Every chair has been returned to its place, every pencil sharpened, every trolley emptied. The room seems almost relieved to enjoy a few quiet hours to itself. Outside, the rain has settled into that gentle sort of conversation only old windows seem able to understand. There will be weather enough tomorrow. Tonight, it merely keeps us company. You may have noticed I walk rather slowly. That is entirely deliberate. Libraries have never responded well to being hurried. In fact, I've occasionally suspected they become a little mischievous when someone rushes. The very book you're looking for develops an astonishing talent for hiding behind another one. Slow down, however. Take your time. And they usually decide to help. That's one of the first lessons I learned here. The second was even simpler. Nothing in this library is trying to impress you. It isn't asking you to remember every detail, or solve every mystery, or understand every impossible place. It merely asks that, for a little while, you keep it company. Should you remember something tomorrow morning, Wonderful. If not, the library has always been remarkably good at remembering things on behalf of other people. Come, the heart of the collection lies just ahead. There's no need to hurry. Some places are worth arriving at slowly. Come along, the heart of the library is just ahead. There are quicker ways of getting there, of course, but I've never been entirely convinced that the quickest route is always the best one. Some places deserve to be approached gradually. They give you time to leave the outside world where it belongs. Ah, here we are, the central reading room. I never quite tire of walking into this room. I've done it more evenings than I could hope to count, yet every time I step beneath these beams, I find myself slowing down without really meaning to. Funny, isn't it? A room can sometimes encourage a particular pace simply by existing. The ceiling rises almost unnoticed above us, disappearing into warm shadows where the oak beams have quietly watched over generations of readers. The brass lamps have already settled into their evening glow. Nothing here is trying to impress. There are grander libraries elsewhere in the world. I've seen a few. Magnificent places, marble floors, painted ceilings, books arranged with military precision. They are very beautiful, but I've always preferred this room. It feels as though it expects you to stay a while, and I rather think that's one of the finest compliments a library can receive. Now, before we go any further, choose a chair. Anyone you like. Don't worry, none of them belongs to anyone in particular. At least, not officially. I have noticed, however, that people tend to return to the same chair without quite realizing they're doing it. Rather like birds choosing a favorite branch. I've had my own preferred chair for years, not because it's especially comfortable, though it is, but because if one sits there on an autumn evening, one can hear the rain on 3 different windows at once. I've always considered that an excellent feature in a chair. If these old armchairs could talk, I suspect they'd have rather more stories than the books surrounding them. They've supported surveyors writing their reports after long expeditions, archivists puzzling over impossible handwriting, conservators resting weary hands after patient work, visitors who arrived intending to stay for half an hour, and somehow looked up to discover the afternoon had quietly become evening. You'll notice the little signs of all those years. A polished armrest, a tiny mark where someone once rested a fountain pen, the faint impression left by countless readers leaning forward at exactly the interesting part. No one has ever thought to remove such things. Why would we? They're part of the room's memory. Some memories belong in books. Others seem perfectly content to remain in the wood and leather. Now then, let's have a little wander. These are the western galleries, the first of many. You'll notice the shelves climbing almost to the ceiling. Visitors often ask whether we've ever considered replacing the rolling ladders with something more modern. The answer is yes, actually, several times. The ladders objected rather strongly though, so we left them where they were. I've always admired good library ladders. They're wonderfully honest things. They ask only that you climb them sensibly. The books themselves are an agreeable mixture. Some wear leather bindings polished smooth by a century of careful hands. Others are wrapped in plain linen, whose colours have softened so gently with age that no 2 people ever seem to agree what colour they actually are. And then there are the newer books, still finding their place amongst the older company. I have a quiet affection for new books. People often imagine librarians prefer ancient volumes. Not at all. Every old treasure was once the newest arrival on the shelf. It simply hadn't earned its stories yet. I am asked from time to time exactly how many books the department owns. I'm afraid I disappoint people with my answer. I don't know. We know how many have been catalogued, how many have been restored, how many are presently out on loan. But the library as a whole, well, it has always displayed a slightly independent attitude towards arithmetic. I've stopped arguing with it. Life has become considerably more peaceful ever since. Now, come over here. There's someone I'd like you to meet. This globe. I've introduced visitors to it for many years. I don't believe it's ever made a particularly dramatic first impression. That's rather its way. At first glance, it appears to be a perfectly respectable Victorian globe. The oceans have faded a little. The brass has acquired that comfortable softness which only many careful hands can produce. Entirely ordinary, until you spend a little time with it. Then, little things begin to appear. A coastline with an extra pencil line. A tiny island no printed atlas has ever admitted exists. A note written in beautifully patient handwriting, besides an otherwise familiar bay. One generation adds an observation, another quietly adds to it. No one announces the change, no one crosses anything out. The globe simply continues the conversation. I've occasionally stood here wondering which surveyor first found the courage to make that very first tiny amendment. Imagine it, holding your pencil above a finished globe, thinking, I believe there's just one more thing people ought to know. It's one of my favourite objects in the library, not because it's complete, quite the opposite, because it has quietly accepted that it never will be. Along this wall stand the catalogue cabinets, thousands upon thousands of little drawers, every one fitted with a brass handle polished by decades of fingertips. Visitors usually ask whether the catalogue is alphabetical. An entirely sensible question. The answer is sometimes, until it isn't. Others suggest chronology. Also correct, on certain afternoons. The truth is rather simpler. The catalogue behaves less like a filing system and more like a conversation. One subject quietly introduces you to another. A journal about an isolated lighthouse recommends a volume on migrating seabirds. That volume suggests a survey of coastal fog, which in turn leads you toward a collection of journals concerning places that seem particularly fond of autumn. I have more than once set out to find a single book, only to discover 2 hours later that the catalogue had gently persuaded me to learn something altogether different. I don't mind though. It generally knows what it's doing. Well, better than I do if I'm honest. On newest arrivals. I always enjoy this part. There is something rather hopeful about books arriving at a library. Boxes tied with cotton tape, freshly restored journals, carefully rolled maps, photographs waiting to be catalogued. Occasionally a small wooden crate accompanied by a note saying, "Please open gently." I've learned to take those notes very seriously. Everything arrives here only after the archivists have finished their work. They are remarkable people, patient enough to spend an afternoon comparing two nearly identical pages simply because one comma appears to have wandered slightly farther to the left than expected. People imagine surveyors write books. Not really. They write journals, working companions, rain-soaked notebooks, pockets full of observations, pressed flowers, sketches made while sitting on a hillside waiting for the mist to make up its mind. The archivists gather all those fragments, patiently, carefully, until one expedition becomes something another generation can understand. Only then does it come here, and when it finally reaches the shelf, it isn't the end of its journey, it's the beginning of countless others. Before we move on, I'd like to show you something. Over here, these cabinets contain photographs, some familiar, some quietly extraordinary. A bridge, an orchard, a lonely harbour, an empty lane disappearing beneath old trees. Nothing that would make a passerby stop, and yet, somehow, everything. You'll notice there are empty spaces, labels already written, catalogue numbers prepared, no photograph yet waiting behind the glass. I rather love that. It means the library has already made room for discoveries that haven't happened yet. Hope deserves proper shelving too. I've believed that for a very long time. Now, you may have begun to notice something else. The shelves seem to stretch a little farther than they did when we first arrived. The gallery bends where you were quite certain it continued straight. A staircase appears between two bookcases you don't remember passing a few moments ago. Don't concern yourself. It does happen from time to time. The architects always produce perfectly accurate plans. The amusing thing is that each set of plans is entirely correct. They simply don't always agree with the previous one. No explanation has ever proved entirely satisfactory. The library has never seemed especially interested in providing one. Personally, I found it much easier to simply enjoy the extra shelves whenever they decide to appear. After all, I've never once heard anyone complain that a library contained too many books. Come, our evening is still wonderfully young, and if memory serves me, there's a little trolley waiting for us with tonight's work, though between ourselves, I'm quietly hoping it contains one or two pleasant surprises. Before we begin this evening's work, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Or perhaps something. My desk. Rather less impressive than people imagine, isn't it? Visitors often expect the Senior Librarian's desk to be covered with mysterious instruments and impossible documents. The truth is considerably less exciting. Ledgers, letters waiting for replies, a magnifying glass that has somehow wandered 3 inches from where I distinctly remember leaving it, several pencils sharpened to slightly different points because one never quite knows which feels right for a particular page, and, naturally, tea. A librarian who claims not to require tea is either remarkably unusual or quietly making coffee when no one is looking. I've occupied this desk for many years now, long enough that it has developed the considerate habit of remembering where I absent-mindedly leave things. Mind you, it occasionally remembers incorrectly. I'm almost certain that's the desk's fault rather than mine. Almost. Now then, our work awaits us. Every evening, once the building grows quiet, one of the archivists leaves a trolley beside my desk. I never know precisely what it will contain. That's one of the pleasures of my job. Some evenings it's a little more than a handful of journals needing catalogue numbers. On others, a parcel arrives from somewhere so remote that even the accompanying letter seems surprised to have found its way here. I've learned not to make assumptions before removing the first piece of cotton tape. Libraries, rather like people, generally reveal themselves one page at a time. You'll notice how carefully everything has been arranged. Nothing piled, nothing hurried. The archivists have a wonderfully calm way of working. I once watched one of them spend nearly half an hour deciding which ribbon should accompany a repaired journal. Not because the ribbon mattered, because the journal did. There's a difference. Now here's something rather special. A survey journal, still carrying the faint scent of leather and rain. You needn't worry. We shan't open it just yet. It's considered good manners to let a newly arrived journal settle for a few hours before asking it to remember where it's been. That may sound rather fanciful. Perhaps it is. But I have found that books appreciate patience every bit as much as readers do. Surveyors rarely write for publication. Most of what you see here was written simply to ensure that tomorrow they would remember what happened today. The handwriting changes as the weather changes. Neat lines become hurried notes when rain begins. Margins fill with little sketches, measurements, questions. Occasionally, the sort of remark one only writes when convinced no one else will ever read it. Those are often my favourites. They remind me that impossible places are still explored by perfectly ordinary people. People who become cold, hungry, occasionally lost, and who still remember to write everything down. Now, let's unfold these carefully. There we are, hand-drawn survey maps. Beautiful things. Not because they're perfect, because they're honest. Every pencil mark represents someone standing in an unfamiliar place, quietly trying to understand it well enough that another person might one day follow. You'll notice there are little corrections. A line altered here, a woodland extended there, the coastline reconsidered after a second visit. I've always admired maps that aren't afraid to admit they were learning. It's a remarkably human quality. One of our surveyors once wrote, "The map became more accurate the moment I accepted it wasn't finished." I've carried that thought with me for many years. It applies to rather more than maps. Come over here for a moment. This little corner is easily overlooked, which is rather appropriate. Some of the finest work in the department happens quietly enough that most visitors never notice it. This is where repaired volumes receive their final attention. New end papers, fresh linen when old cloth has finally surrendered, a carefully pressed bookplate bearing the department's seal. I've always enjoyed watching the conservators at work. They possess that rare ability to spend an entire afternoon improving something without leaving any obvious evidence they were ever there. That's the highest compliment one can pay a conservator. When their work is finished, the book simply feels as though it has always been whole. Now, this is where each new arrival officially joins the collection. Not when it enters the building, not when it's unpacked. Here, when someone sits quietly at this desk and begins to write its record. I remember cataloguing my very first journal. I was convinced I'd make some dreadful mistake, misspell a title, transpose a number, accidentally shelve an expedition to the northern marshes beside a study of mounting observatories. My predecessor smiled, he did that quite a lot, and said, "If you ever make a mistake, make it neatly. It gives the next librarian something satisfying to correct." Fortunately, I never tested the theory. Well, not very often. Cataloguing isn't simply recording where a book belongs. It's introducing it to every other book already waiting here, rather like introducing a new neighbour to the rest of the street. We're finished for the moment. Come, Let's stretch our legs. I found that libraries appreciate movement every now and then. Not hurried footsteps, just a gentle walk between shelves. This corridor is one of the quieter parts of the building. Even during the day it seems to prefer whispers. The lamps are spaced a little farther apart here. The shadows linger longer between the bookcases. Some visitors find that rather mysterious. I've always found it comforting. Not every corner of a library needs to reveal itself immediately. As we walk, you may notice the building making little sounds around us. Timber settling. A distant page turning somewhere that certainly ought to be empty at this hour. The old heating pipes considering whether they really need to wake for another evening. Nothing alarming. Old buildings have conversations with themselves. One simply grows accustomed to listening. We'll be leaving the working rooms behind now. Ahead of us, the North Gallery waits. I must confess, it's one of my favourite parts of the library, though I probably shouldn't admit that. The other galleries might become quite jealous. Fortunately, books are wonderfully discreet. I don't believe they'll tell them. Before we continue into the galleries, there's one last thing I'd like to collect. This old lantern. No, we don't really need it. The electric lamps are perfectly dependable. But I find myself carrying it on these evening walks all the same. Habit, perhaps. Or sentiment. It's difficult to say where one ends and the other begins after enough years. It belonged to the librarian who trained me. He carried it every evening, even after electricity had reached this part of the building. One night, when I finally asked him why, he looked at me with the faintest smile and said, "It's not for helping me see. It's for reminding me to look." At the time I nodded as though I understood completely. I didn't. Not until many years later. Nowadays I bring it with me simply because, well, it seems to enjoy coming along. And I've learned that arguing with old traditions rarely improves either one's evening or one's temper. Come, the North Gallery is waiting. You'll notice the building becoming a little quieter now. Not because there are fewer books, quite the opposite. The shelves are becoming denser. The walls seem to draw a little closer together. Even the lamps appear to have decided that softer light will do perfectly well. I've always liked this corridor. During the day, it's simply a passage between one room and another. At night, it becomes something else. A place that encourages slower thoughts. Do you hear that faint ticking? No, not the clock. The rain against the leaded windows. Thousands of tiny drops. Everyone arriving with impeccable punctuality. It's one of my favourite sounds in the whole department. Some evenings I find myself stopping here for no better reason than to listen for a minute or two. I've decided there are far worse ways to spend one's time. Here we are, the North Gallery. I should probably warn you, people tend to linger here rather longer than they intended. Even I occasionally arrive with one purpose in mind and leave having completely forgotten what it was. Fortunately, the gallery has always been remarkably forgiving. The shelves here contain some of the department's oldest working journals. Not necessarily the oldest books, Those are kept elsewhere under rather more careful conditions. These are different. These are the books that people actually lived with, volumes carried through forests, across lonely coastlines, up mountains, into forgotten villages, around impossible islands. If you look closely, you'll notice that very few of them are immaculate, thank goodness. A perfectly preserved survey journal usually means it never went anywhere interesting. The truly valuable ones carry little reminders of the journeys they've made. A rubbed corner, rain-darkened leather, the faint outline where a pressed firm rested between the pages for 20 years before someone finally discovered it. Books grow old rather gracefully, I think. People could probably learn something from that. Come a little closer. There's no need to whisper, although most people do. Perhaps it's simply because the books seem to be listening. These shelves have changed very little during my time here. Every now and then someone suggests reorganizing them. More efficient, better use of space, clearer numbering. Perfectly sensible ideas. Oddly enough, though, they never seem to happen. Not through stubbornness, simply because, after a day or two, everyone quietly agrees the shelves were probably right all along. Libraries possess a curious talent for winning arguments without ever appearing to take part in them. I rather admire that. If you run your fingers lightly along the wood, go on, you feel how smooth the oak has become. Not through polishing, through decades of quiet hands passing by. Readers, archivists, surveyors, conservators, generations of people searching for something they hoped might be waiting. Most of the time, it was. Now, here's something that usually attracts a second glance. Shelf 14. Shelf 14 and a half. Shelf 15. Yes, the numbering is entirely correct. At least, it is now. I've been asked many times why there is a shelf 14 and a half. I'm afraid the official records are surprisingly unhelpful. There are several theories. One suggests the gallery was altered during an expansion many decades ago. Another insists the shelf has always been there. Personally, I've never managed to decide which explanation I prefer. The curious thing is that nobody who works here finds it especially unusual. One simply reaches for shelf 14 and a half when one needs it. Rather like stepping over the third stair at home because it always creaked a little louder than the others. You stop noticing after a while. Visitors, however, they almost always smile, which rather pleases me. Libraries should contain at least one thing that makes people smile before they've even opened a book. Since we're here, let's take a closer look. You'll notice it isn't quite the same width as its neighbours, only a little narrower, as though someone realised at the very last moment that there was just enough room for one more shelf after all. I've often wondered whether that's exactly what happened. Then again, I've often wondered a great many things in this building. These particular journals concern places that have proved, well, difficult to classify. Not dangerous, not secret, simply reluctant to fit comfortably inside ordinary categories. A valley remembered differently by every visitor. A staircase appearing in 3 separate counties. A lighthouse whose keeper insisted the tide arrived according to conversation rather than the moon. Perfectly respectable reports. Merely a little awkward to shelve elsewhere. Perhaps that's why this shelf seems so content. It's been looking after books that don't mind being slightly difficult. between ourselves, I think every library should have one shelf reserved for things that refuse to fit in anywhere else. People too. Now then, let's see what tonight has chosen for us. Notice I didn't say what we have chosen. I've learned after many years that evenings such as these have a gentle habit of making that decision for us. There. This one. No particular reason. It simply seems ready. The leather is worn smooth around the spine, the corners softened by many careful hands. Someone has tied a narrow linen ribbon around it, which usually means the conservators thought it deserved a little extra kindness. That's recommendation enough for me. Would you do me a favour? Hold the lantern for just a moment. Thank you. There we are. You know, I still enjoy this part every bit as much as I did on my first week here. Choosing the evening's journal always feels a little like opening a letter from an old friend. One never knows precisely what will be inside, only that the conversation is likely to be worth having. Come, I think we've earned a comfortable table. Let's find somewhere quiet before we open it together. Before we open tonight's journal, there's somewhere I'd like to visit first. Just over here. These old map cabinets have occupied this corner of the library for longer than anyone seems able to remember. Heavy old things. Oak throughout, brass handles polished smooth by generations of careful hands. Every drawer opens with the same gentle reluctance, as though asking, "Are you quite certain you need this one?" I've learned not to pull too quickly. Old furniture appreciates good manners. People often imagine maps belonged on walls. Personally, I've always thought they belong in drawers. A wall displays a map. A drawer invites a conversation with it. Come, let's see what tonight has waiting for us. We'll need a little room. Maps have a remarkable tendency to underestimate how much space they require. One begins with a neat little corner, and somehow ends up occupying an entire table. I've watched 3 surveyors spend half an afternoon trying to fold a single chart exactly as they found it. By the end, they agreed only on one thing. It had almost certainly been folded differently before they opened it. Fortunately, maps are wonderfully forgiving. This table has seen rather a lot over the years. Charts of coastlines no longer quite where they used to be. Sketches of forgotten villages. Astronomical observations. Pressed flowers accidentally left inside journals before someone noticed them 6 months later. Even the faint scratches in the oak have become part of the library's memory. Every mark represents someone trying to understand the place just a little better than they did yesterday. I rather like that. There we are. Let's begin with something modest. People sometimes expect department maps to look dramatic. Wild colours, impossible symbols, perhaps the occasional dragon. I'm afraid they'll be disappointed. Often surveyors were practical people. If they encountered something extraordinary, they simply drew it as carefully as everything else. I've always admired that. The impossible deserves neat handwriting. Take a look at these pencil lines. See how lightly they begin, growing darker only as certainty increases. One of the finest surveyors I ever knew refused to ink a line until he'd walked it 3 separate times. He used to say, confidence is earned 1 footstep at a time. It made him wonderfully slow. It also made him remarkably accurate. Now, here's something I always enjoy showing visitors. 3 maps, the same valley, drawn by 3 different surveyors. At first glance, they're almost identical. Then, little differences begin to appear. A stream bends slightly farther east. A stand of birch trees occupies a different hillside. One narrow footpath simply refuses to agree with the others. The first time I saw these together, I assumed someone must have made an error. My predecessor looked over my shoulder and quietly said, "Or perhaps they all visited on different mornings." I've never forgotten that. Places, like people, are not always exactly the same from one day to the next, especially the places we keep here. Come a little nearer. Don't worry about breathing on the paper. It's older than both of us put together. It has survived sea spray, mountain mist, a spilled mug of tea, if this faint ring is anything to go by, and what appears to have been an unfortunate encounter with blackberry juice. I think it will forgive us. It's the little notes I love most. Wind stronger than expected. Excellent place to stop for lunch. Do not trust the bridge after heavy rain. Practical observations, ordinary thoughts, tiny moments of humanity quietly preserved beside impossible discoveries. Sometimes tucked into a margin you'll find a sentence that was never intended for anyone else. A reminder. A joke. The beginnings of homesickness. Those are the moments that always make me pause. They remind me that every line on every map was drawn by someone who missed home from time to time. Now this is a familiar hand. Edwin Mercer, one of our finest surveyors. Though if you had ever suggested such a thing to him, he would have looked terribly embarrassed and changed the subject. His handwriting is unmistakable, perfectly balanced, patient, every letter standing exactly where it ought to. I've spent enough years amongst these journals that I can recognise some surveyors before I've even reached their signature. A peculiar skill, perhaps, but rather a comforting one. Here, read this little note with me. Returned in early autumn. The path was easier to follow once I stopped expecting it to behave like an ordinary path. I always smile when I read that sentence. It's wonderfully Edwin, practical, observant, and quietly accepting that the world occasionally has ideas of its own. I've often wondered how many useful lessons begin in exactly that way. Well, I think we've borrowed these long enough. Let's put everything back where it belongs. There's a curious satisfaction in returning maps to their drawers. Perhaps because it feels less like putting something away, and more like wishing an old traveller a peaceful night's rest. There we are. Safe again. I've noticed visitors sometimes apologise for taking so much care when handling our collection. There's never any need. The library has survived because countless ordinary people each treated one small thing with a little kindness. No single person preserved all of this. Everyone simply looked after the part that happened to be in front of them. I found that rather encouraging. Now, our maps are resting, the journal is waiting, and I believe, if memory serves, there's someone downstairs who has been quietly mending books all evening. I'd very much like you to meet them. They do extraordinary work, though they would be absolutely horrified to hear me describe it that way. They insist they're simply doing their job. Personally, I think that's exactly what makes it extraordinary. Before we settle down with tonight's journal, there's one more room I'd very much like you to see. It's tucked away behind an ordinary-looking door, just along this passage. Most visitors walk straight past it, which, in fairness, is entirely understandable. The door isn't trying to attract attention. neither are the people who work beyond it. If the surveyors are responsible for discovering remarkable places, and the archivists for understanding them, then the conservators ensure those discoveries may still be read 100 years from now. I sometimes think they are the quietest heroes in the entire department. Though if you repeated that to one of them, they'd blush furiously and insist you'd mistaken them for someone else. Come, let's not disturb anything more than necessary. There we are. Do take a moment before looking at the tools. Listen instead. Can you hear it? Not very much. Exactly. It's one of the quietest rooms in the building. The silence here isn't empty. It's simply occupied. Occupied by careful thought, patient hands, and the sort of concentration that cannot be hurried. Now, have a look around. A bone folder polished smooth by years of use. Small brushes finer than paintbrushes, linen threads arranged by colour. Tiny pots of adhesive mixed fresh each morning. Everything has its place. I've occasionally wondered what would happen if someone rearranged the workbench. Then I remembered I enjoy remaining on good terms with the conservators. Some mysteries are best left unexplored. This is something I always enjoy showing people. A conservation cradle. It doesn't look particularly remarkable. In fact, it rather resembles a comfortable cushion, which, in a way, it's precisely what it is. Old books grow rather stiff with age, much like certain librarians I can mention. Opening them flat would be uncomfortable, possibly painful. So instead, we support them exactly where they wish to rest. I've always liked that idea. Working with a book rather than expecting it to accommodate us. There's a lesson in that somewhere, though I shall leave you to discover it for yourself. Now, this little porcelain basin has served the department for longer than anyone presently working here. Not for washing hands, well, not usually. It's used for preparing delicate papers before repairs begin. Fresh water, clean cloth. Nothing dramatic. One of the first lessons every conservator learns is that the smallest intervention is often the best one. I've watched remarkable repairs take place in this room, not because anyone performed miracles, but because someone chose patience over haste. It's an oddly reassuring philosophy. The world seems rather fond of quick fixes these days. Old books remain politely unconvinced. Now this is lovely. Would you look at that? A pressed wildflower, still resting between two pages after all these years. One might imagine the conservators remove little discoveries like this immediately. Quite the opposite. The first question is never, what is it? The first question is, why was it left here? Perhaps a surveyor wished to identify it later. Perhaps it marked an important page. Or perhaps it was simply beautiful. I've always rather hoped it was the last reason. There is something quite comforting about the thought that, even while documenting impossible landscapes, someone still paused to admire an ordinary flower. I've known surveyors well enough to believe they probably did. Not every survive is botanical. Occasionally, a railway ticket appears between the pages, a faded receipt, a feather, a handwritten shopping list. Once, rather memorably, an entire slice of pressed orange. No one has ever satisfactorily explained that one. The department has a simple rule regarding such discoveries. Nothing is thrown away. Everything has a story, even if we've forgotten what it is. Each little object is placed into its own protective envelope, labelled carefully, returned to the journal it accompanied. Future generations may understand something we have overlooked. Libraries have always been wonderfully patient with unanswered questions. They're quite content to wait another 100 years if necessary. There. Finished. You might find yourself wondering exactly what changed. That's entirely natural. The finest conservation work is almost invisible. A repaired hinge, a strengthened page, a loose thread quietly persuaded back into place. Nothing announcing itself. The book simply looks comfortable again, ready to be opened, ready to be trusted. I've always thought there's something deeply hopeful about restoration. Not because it makes old things new. It doesn't. Nor should it. Every crease, every softened corner, every little mark earned honestly through years of careful use, those remain as they should. The purpose isn't to erase history. It's to make sure history can continue. There, back onto the trolley you go. Another journal quietly prepared for many more evenings of curious readers and gentle conversations. You know, people occasionally ask me which room in the department is my favourite. I usually avoid answering. It hardly seems fair on the others. But if one were to choose a room that best explains what this place truly is, I think it might just be this one. Not because remarkable discoveries arrive here, because kindness does. Every repaired page is a small promise made to someone who hasn't yet walked through these doors, and I find that a rather wonderful thing to spend one's life doing. Come, we've earned a short rest. I know a sitting room with a fire that's probably beginning to wonder where we've got to. I suspect the kettle may already have reached the same conclusion. Well, I think we've earned a little rest. Come in, don't worry about knocking. The room has known me for rather a long time now. This is my sitting room. I hesitate to call it an office. The word always sounds rather busier than the room itself would appreciate. It's not very large, nor was it ever intended to be. Just enough space for a comfortable chair, a small writing desk, far more books than any sensible person requires, and a fireplace that has become an old and trusted companion over the years. Do make yourself comfortable. That armchair by the fire has an excellent view of the windows. I've often sat there while waiting for particularly difficult cataloguing problems to solve themselves. Remarkably, they sometimes do. Not because the answers appear by magic, simply because a quiet room has a wonderful way of arranging one's thoughts. I've grown rather fond of that chair, though I promise it doesn't mind being shared. The fire is still awake. Excellent. I've never entirely trusted rooms that are completely silent. A fire understands conversation. It never interrupts. It simply offers the occasional little crackle to remind you that it's still listening. There was once an elderly archivist who insisted every important decision in the department should be discussed beside the fireplace. When asked why, he replied, "Cold rooms encourage short conversations." I've often wondered if he was right. Certainly some of the finest ideas I've ever heard arrived accompanied by the sound of burning oak. You'll notice that the mantelpiece is rather plain. That isn't by accident. Libraries have enough interesting things already. One needn't ask the fireplace to compete with them. Now then, the kettle has behaved impeccably this evening. It usually does, though I suspect it knows I'd speak rather kindly of it if anyone asked. Would you care for some tea? I do hope so. The department has accumulated an astonishing collection of teapots over the years. No one seems entirely sure how. Surveyors have a habit of returning from expeditions with maps, strange stones, occasionally an unusual biscuit tin, and, every now and then, a teapot that somehow seemed too interesting to leave behind. This one has been here longer than I have. I have no idea where it came from, but it pours beautifully. I've learned not to ask too many questions beyond that. There we are. Careful, the cup is warm. I've always believed tea tastes slightly better when shared with good company. Fortunately, tonight it is. Come over to the window for a moment. The rain has almost finished. Can you see the courtyard? The stones always darken beautifully after an evening shower. The old yew tree looks as though someone has carefully polished every leaf. And listen. Somewhere out there, water is still finding its way from rooftop to gutter, from gutter to drain, in no particular hurry at all. I sometimes stand here long after everyone else has gone home. Not because I'm waiting for anything, simply because the library seems happiest at this hour. It has done everything that was asked of it during the day. Now it can simply be itself. I think people need evenings like that too. That little courtyard has seen generations of librarians come and go. On fine mornings, you'll often find one of the archivists eating breakfast out there before the building opens. Another insists it's the best place to read correspondence. A conservator occasionally takes tea beneath the old tree whenever a repair has required particularly steady hands. We're all creatures of habit in our own quiet ways. The pigeons certainly know us very well. There's one rather determined fellow who's spent years convinced the windowsill belongs exclusively to him. I've never had the heart to disagree. He's probably been here longer than I have. I've found that sharing a building with birds is rather good for one's perspective. They remain entirely unimpressed by catalogue systems. Have you noticed? We've hardly spoken for the last minute or two. I rather like that. Some people become anxious when conversation pauses. Libraries rarely do. Comfortable silence is one of their greatest gifts. I remember a young archivist apologising once because we'd spent an entire afternoon working together without saying very much. I told her there was nothing to apologise for. We'd been listening. She looked slightly puzzled, so I explained. Old buildings speak quietly. Books speak more quietly still. If one fills every moment with conversation, one occasionally misses what they have to say. She nodded. Then we returned to our work. We hardly spoke again until supper. It remains one of the nicest afternoons I can remember. Well, our tea has grown dangerously close to becoming cold. A sure sign that we've been enjoying ourselves. I do hope you're finding the library as welcoming as I'd hoped you might. It's a curious place. Not because impossible things happen here, though from time to time they certainly do. No. It's curious because it has never expected perfection from the people who care for it. Only patience, kindness, and a willingness to keep learning. Those seem wonderfully reasonable expectations. Would you indulge me in one small confession, after all of these years? I still feel quietly grateful every evening when someone chooses to spend a little time here. Libraries are built for readers. Without them, they're simply rather handsome buildings filled with paper. So, thank you for walking with me tonight. I suspect we should continue. The journal we've chosen has waited patiently on the reading table all this while. It would be terribly rude to keep it waiting much longer. Besides, I have a feeling its story may prove worth the delay. Shall we continue? This way. Mind the step. It catches almost everyone the first time. There. Welcome to the register room. I've always found this room rather difficult to describe, not because it's mysterious, although visitors often imagine it must be. It's simply important. Quietly important. Almost every expedition you've heard about tonight eventually finds its way here. Every journal, every map, every carefully repaired volume, every small discovery patiently made somewhere beyond the ordinary world. Sooner or later, someone sits at one of these desks, opens a ledger, dips a pen, and says, "Yes, we'll remember this." I've always thought that was rather a wonderful responsibility. Come over here. These are the registers themselves. They're heavier than they appear, not because of the paper, because of everything the paper carries. I still remember the first time I was trusted to enter a new record. I must have checked my handwriting half a dozen times before committing ink to the page. My predecessor watched the entire performance with remarkable patience. When I'd finally finished, he looked at the entry for a long moment before saying, "Good. Now the department knows where to find it again." At the time I thought he meant the book. Years later I realized he meant the place. There is a comforting thought in that, don't you think? Somewhere, no matter how unusual a place may be, someone cared enough to write down that it existed. Let's have a look. Don't worry, these pages are meant to be read. You'll notice there are no dramatic flourishes, no elaborate titles, no unnecessary decoration, just neat handwriting. Dates, locations, references, cross-references. The department has always believed extraordinary discoveries deserve ordinary honesty. I've always admired that. There is something deeply reassuring about impossible places being recorded with the same care one might use to catalogue a parish church or an old bridge. No excitement, no exaggeration, simply the truth as faithfully observed. Sometimes I think that's one of the reasons these records have lasted so long. They were never trying to astonish anyone, only to remember accurately. Now, you'll probably smile at this. Yes, we still use fountain pens. Not exclusively, of course. Computers have proved perfectly useful companions for many tasks. The department has never objected to progress, only to haste. There is something about writing slowly with a fountain pen that encourages careful thought. One tends not to rush a sentence when one knows it cannot easily be taken back. I confess, I have a favourite pen. There it is, the rather ordinary black one. Nothing remarkable to look at. It simply fits my hand as though we've grown old together. Perhaps we have. It's written thousands of catalogue entries, a few letters, the occasional shopping list, and I'm slightly ashamed to admit, one very polite apology after spilling tea on a memorandum many years ago. One very polite apology after spilling tea on a memorandum many years ago. Fortunately, the memorandum survived. My dignity, though, required a little longer. Now then, I wonder, would you like to try something? Choose any drawer, whichever one catches your eye. Go on. Oh, excellent choice. I had a feeling you might pick that one. Open it gently. There, hundreds of little cards, every one written by hand. The curious thing is that people often assume the catalogue exists to tell us where books are. It does, but only partly. The real purpose is to help one discovery find another. A survey of forgotten gardens quietly introduces itself to a journal concerning abandoned orchards. That journal points towards a collection of weather observations. Those observations somehow lead you to a lighthouse, and before you know it, you've spent a thoroughly enjoyable afternoon learning something you never intended to look for. I never minded that. In fact, I rather suspect curiosity enjoys wandering more than arriving. Over here, this little wall has always been one of my favourite corners. No grand portraits, no elaborate memorials, just silhouettes, simple brass nameplates, quiet acknowledgements of people who devoted part of their lives to this place. I knew a few of them, not all. Some retired before I arrived. Others, well, time eventually asks us all to hand our work to somebody else. I still catch myself remembering little things. One always whistled while repairing ledgers. Another insisted every pencil should be sharpened before lunch, whether it needed it or not. One surveyor never passed through the entrance hall without removing his hat, even when nobody else was there. Little habits, perfectly ordinary. Strange, isn't it? Those are often the memories that remain longest, not the remarkable expeditions, just the quiet ways people moved through the world. I rather like that. It reminds me that kindness leaves surprisingly durable footprints. Well, I think we've finished here for tonight. Let's close the ledger together. There. Do you hear that gentle sound? The pages settling back into one another. I've always loved that sound. It reminds me that another small piece of department's work is safely tucked away until it's needed again. People sometimes ask whether the registers are ever truly complete. I don't believe they are, nor should they be. As long as there are places waiting to be found, there will always be another page, another careful entry, another name, another journey, and I find that thought wonderfully hopeful. You know, when I first became Senior Librarian, I imagined my duty was to look after the books. It took me rather longer to realise the books were quietly looking after us as well. They remind us where we've been, who we've met, what we've learned, and perhaps most importantly, what still remains to be discovered. Come, there's one final room I'd like to show you before our evening together draws to a close. It's a room we visit only occasionally, not because it's hidden, simply because it asks us to arrive in the right frame of mind. I think tonight is one of those nights. Before we go in, let's pause for just a moment. Not because we have to, simply because this room has always seemed to appreciate an unhurried arrival. You'll notice the little brass plaque upon the door. Just one word. Remembrance. Nothing more elaborate has ever been needed. Everyone who works here knows this room, not because they're expecting to visit it, but because sooner or later everyone finds a reason to. The first time I came here, I was a very young assistant librarian. I remember standing exactly where you are now, wondering what made this room different from all the others. My predecessor didn't answer immediately. He rested his hand lightly beneath the plaque and simply said, "Some rooms are entered with curiosity. This one is entered with gratitude." I've remembered those words ever since. Come. There. This is the Room of Remembrance. Smaller than many people expect. I rather like that. It was never intended to impress anyone, only to offer a little quiet. You'll notice there are no grand displays, no polished trophies, no cabinets filled with remarkable discoveries. Those belong elsewhere. This room remembers people, not achievements. I think there's a great difference between the two. The lamps burn a little lower here, not because the room is solemn, but because softer light somehow seems to encourage gentler thoughts. Even after all these years, I find myself lowering my voice without quite meaning to. Old habits have a curious way of choosing us. Along this wall you'll find a handful of familiar things. A well-used magnifying glass, a surveyor's compass, a favourite fountain pen, a pair of spectacles with one arm carefully repaired. Nothing of great monetary value, everything of great personal value. Each belonged to someone who spent part of their life caring for this department. People occasionally ask why these objects are here. The answer is surprisingly simple, because someone smiled when they saw them. I've learned that remembrance doesn't always require portraits or plaques. Sometimes a worn wooden ruler says everything that needs saying about the person who carried it for 40 years. These drawers contain letters, not official correspondence, but personal letters. Some were written during expeditions, others after safe returns. A few were never posted at all, not because they were forgotten, simply because by the time they were written the writer had already found the words they needed. I've read only a very small number over the years, enough to understand something. The remarkable thing about extraordinary people is how ordinary their letters often are. They ask after friends, wonder whether the tomatoes survived the summer, complain greatly about damp boots, promise to bring home better tea next time. It always makes me smile. The impossible may have occupied their days, but home was never very far from their thoughts. Come and stand here beside me. This is my favourite window in the entire department. Not because of the view, though it is a pleasant one, because of the light. On autumn evenings just before sunset, it fills the room with a gentlest amber glow for perhaps 5 minutes. Everything seems wrapped in a warm honey-coloured light. No one planned it. The architect certainly didn't. It's simply one of those quiet little gifts old buildings occasionally discover for themselves. I've stood here through more seasons than I can easily count, watching leaves arrive, snow gather, spring rain, summer evenings stretching long into twilight. The view changes, the room doesn't. There's something deeply reassuring about that. You know, people often imagine remembrance means refusing to let go. I've never believed that. I think remembrance is simply another form of companionship. The people whose names are honoured here are no longer walking these corridors. And yet, in little ways, they still accompany us. When I sharpen a pencil exactly as Margaret preferred, when someone folds a map using Edwin's wonderfully methodical approach, when an archivist smiles because they finally deciphered handwriting that would have delighted Arthur. Small things, almost invisible, but they continue. The department isn't built from stone alone. It's built from the habits kindly passed from one generation to the next. Perhaps that's how all worthwhile places endure. Not because they remain unchanged, but because people quietly care enough to continue them. Well, I think we've stayed just long enough. This room has never encouraged lengthy visits. Not because anyone wishes to leave, simply because remembrance has a curious way of following us once we've stepped outside. Let us leave the door exactly as we found it. There, thank you. You know, people sometimes ask whether I find this room sad. I never do. Grateful, certainly. Thoughtful, very often, but never sad. Every person remembered here helped leave the library a little better than they found it. It's difficult to be sorrowful in the presence of that kind of generosity. As we walk back into the corridor, you'll notice the library feels just a little different. Or perhaps we do. I rather suspect every pleasant evening leaves us changed in small ways. One rarely notices immediately. The understanding arrives quietly, usually some days later. A remembered sentence, a familiar smell, the sound of rain on old windows, and suddenly one finds oneself smiling without quite knowing why. Come, there's one last place I'd like us to visit together before the night draws to its close. After all, no evening in the department should end in a hurry. There is one final tradition I should very much like to share with you. Well, I think it's time our journal found its way back to the shelf. Every book deserves a little rest after a good conversation. There we are, back exactly where it belongs. I've always found that rather satisfying. Not because the evening is ending, but because everything has quietly returned to its proper place. The journal is home. The maps are resting peacefully in their drawers. The registers are closed. The lamps continue their patient watch. Somehow, the library always seems to know when another day has been completed. I rather admire that. Come, let's take the long way back. I've never been fond of rushing towards endings. The corridors feel different now. Not emptier, simply more settled. The building has grown accustomed to the night once again. Listen. Our footsteps have become part of the library's conversation. The rain has almost disappeared. The fire will be quietly fading to glowing embers. Somewhere, one of the old clocks has decided another hour has slipped gently by. Old buildings keep time differently. Not more slowly, simply more thoughtfully. I've often wished people allowed themselves the same kindness. Our last little duty. Each evening the lamps are extinguished in much the same order they were lit. Not because anyone wrote it into a rule book, simply because traditions have a gentle way of arranging themselves over the years. One by one, their warm circles of light quietly disappear. A reading chair returns to shadow. A writing desk settles into darkness. The gallery softens. Nothing abrupt, nothing theatrical, just a peaceful reminder that every day, however pleasant, eventually gives way to night. I used to think I was the one saying goodnight to the library. These days, I'm not entirely convinced it isn't saying goodnight to me. We've arrived back where we began. It always surprises me how different the entrance hall feels after walking through the building for an evening. Perhaps it's simply because we know it a little better now. The portraits are watching over everything as patiently as ever. The polished floor reflects the last remaining lamplight. Even the old umbrella stand seems perfectly content with its night's work. Funny, when visitors first arrive, they usually look towards the library. When they leave, they often pause for one last look back. I always rather like that. It suggests the building has managed to make a new friend. Well, I believe this is where we part company. For this evening, at least. Before you go, may I offer you one small piece of advice? Don't hurry back into the world outside just yet. Stand beneath the shelter for a moment. Listen to the rain, if it's still falling. Take one slow breath. Allow the quiet you've found here to accompany you a little farther than the front steps. Libraries have always had a curious habit of lingering gently in one's thoughts. You may find tomorrow afternoon, or perhaps next week, that something reminds you of this evening. The smell of old paper, a warm lamp in a window, the sound of rain against glass. If it does, I hope it makes you smile. Before I lock the door, there's one tradition I haven't told you about. Every evening, after everyone has gone, one lamp remains burning. Just one. Not because anyone expects a visitor, nor because someone has forgotten to extinguish it. It remains lit because, well, I've always liked the idea that every library should keep one small light shining for those who have not yet found their way through its doors. Perhaps it's an old-fashioned thought. If so, I don't mind in the slightest. Some old-fashioned thoughts deserve looking after. There, now you know. I trust you'll keep it between ourselves. The library rather enjoys having one or two quiet secrets. Before you leave, just one last look. Beautiful, isn't it? The trees seem to draw a little closer around the buildings after the rain. The cobbles catch the moonlight like polished stone. The lantern above the doorway has become a tiny golden star against the old brickwork. From here, the department looks almost ordinary. I rather like that. The most extraordinary places seldom feel any need to announce themselves. Thank you, truly, for spending your evening with me. It has been a pleasure to share this place with someone willing to wander slowly, ask quiet questions, and notice small things. I hope the library has offered you a little peace, perhaps a little curiosity, and maybe one or two thoughts worth carrying home. The department will still be here tomorrow. The lamps will be lit. The books will be waiting patiently upon their shelves. There will always be another journal to open, another map to unfold, another impossible place to understand. So, whenever you find yourself in need of a quiet evening, you know where to find us. Until then, travel safely, be kind to yourself, and should you happen to pass an old library somewhere, do pause for a moment. You never know what stories may already be waiting inside. Good night.